Welcome one and all, I'm Josh Rivers, and the time has come for me to bury a hatchet. Procedural generation. The act of generating vast amounts of digital content through the use of an algorithm. It's a tool that has existed since the gaming equivalent of time immemorial, and a great deal of use has been found for it, from randomizing loot drops, all the way up to generating entire game worlds. Not just in the sense of a game like Minecraft, which is designed to generate unique sandboxes for every player in which they may create their various tributes to the one true God whose name mankind dare not speak, but it can also be used as a development tool to help create the massive open worlds that every game has to have now, presumably so that game developers don't spend their entire lives laboriously handcrafting 1,000 distinct trees. But these days, procedural generation enjoys a more visible, more active role in the design of many games. I am talking, of course, about roguelikes and roguelike elements. Now, these roguelikes and roguelites are designed to be played over and over and over and over again in runs, and to facilitate this, all the game environments are randomly generated each time you enter them, so no two runs will be the same. And in these games, that randomization is the selling point, effectively. Procedural generation becomes the main focus of the game, rather than a secondary or even background detail, because that is how you can have a game designed around the concept of repetition, while hopefully avoiding making it feel repetitive. It's not hard to see why this concept took off in this industry that is obsessed with replayability, or engagement if you're feeling corporate. After all, it's an idea that allows you to take a few core concepts and spin them into theoretically infinite amounts of content. It would certainly be fair to suggest that that attitude is part of why roguelike elements got so popular, and why they have ended up in so many games. The Binding of Isaac, Enter the Gungeon, The Swindle, Darkest Dungeon, Invisible Ink, Dead by Daylight's reward system, which, I mean, that might be its own video, because I actually find that quite interesting. And even the recent-ish God of War, where they have a section that's a roguelike because they needed something to put in one of the 9 realms, which is a good segue to start talking about the problem that I have. You see, like everything that's popular, there are people who do it purely to do it, thus completely missing the point and not really adding anything of value to the experience. Take Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons, for instance. They're there. You can do them. It's the least interesting bit of the game. It's not that they're bad, it's not that they're not fun to play, but when you put them next to the beautifully and intricately and deliberately designed world of Bloodborne proper, they don't really hold up as well. And that's not to say don't do it. Never to say don't do it. There are some really good games that have been made this way. I bloody love Enter the Gungeon, and Darkest Dungeon, and The Binding of Ungeon, and The Swindly Swungeon. But you've got to understand why you're doing it. You can't just be throwing in roguelike elements for its own sake. You need to be going into the project with the right ethos. And I'm going to demonstrate what that ethos is for you now, by comparing 2 games that attempted to blend the Metroidvania and roguelike styles with 2 different approaches and staggeringly different results. And those games are Dead Cells and Sundered. Dead Cells is fundamentally a run-based roguelike game in the same vein as Binding of Isaac or Enter the Gungeon, but applied to a 2D side-scrolling platformer and given Metroidvania elements, such as the gradual acquisition of abilities that allow you to access new areas. Sundered is a Metroidvania game from the people behind Jotun, which you can probably tell just by looking at it. And it's premised around the idea that you're going to die a lot because Dark Souls is popular. And, possibly to alleviate the resulting repetition, the game includes roguelike elements. Includes a roguelike element. The rooms are randomized. A bit. Within some very big, very obvious constraints that I will explain later. But the thing to be noted at this stage is that both of these games are essentially two opposite sides of the same coin. Dead Cells is a roguelike game with Metroidvania elements, whereas Sundered is a Metroidvania game with roguelike elements. Now, just so that I've got this front-loaded, Dead Cells is the roguelike that I think works, and Sundered is the one that I think doesn't. And all the reasons I'm about to present for why that is essentially boil down to that one difference that I just described. That difference perfectly represents the difference in ethos that I feel will dictate whether a roguelike will work or not. The starting point for Dead Cells is a roguelike. The starting point for Sundered isn't. Let's start by talking about Dead Cells, because I've been saying Dead Cells before Sundered this entire video, and it would now bother me to suddenly start doing it the other way around. Dead Cells is a hack and slash time with platforming, where you chop up some boys to make them leave. This you must do as you traverse the procedurally generated board in search of the exit, which will take you to a new area with more fun secrets and new challenges to be overcome through the medium of additional chopping. As is customary, there is randomised loot, randomised items you can find throughout the map that will help you to do a fight real good. There's a bunch of different primary weapons, secondary weapons, there are different shields you can have instead of a secondary weapon if you're a coward. Then separately from those you have slots that you can use for either different grenades or different traps. And grenades are obviously more direct damage, whereas traps are more tactical. Oh, nuance. These items all have different advantages that will cater to different playstyles. Items also come with different levels and different stat modifiers, so as well as finding new items, you could just find a better version of an item you already have. And items can also come with any one, or sometimes two, of 3 colour-coded natures, I guess you'd call them? Disciplines? Principalities? There's 3 colours. And you can find items throughout the levels that let you put points into one of those colours, and that will increase the effectiveness of any items you've got that have those colours. All of which is to basically say that Dead Cells clearly takes a lot of cues from the Binding of Isaac school of design, but with enough tweaks and changes to make it its own tangibly distinct experience. It's a 2D hack and slash instead of a bullet hell, obviously. The items can have variable stats now. And then, of course, there's the addition of Metroidvania-style abilities that are permanent once you get them. They'll persist through all of your future runs. And they will allow you to interact with various clearly conspicuous bits of the environment. And that obviously gives you access to more stuff, and even alternate routes to progress through a run. The permanence of these abilities also helps lend a sense of concrete progression to the game. A sense that all of your effort doesn't just get thrown away at the end of each run. This was actually one of the things I loved about Enter the Gungeon. Even if you weren't getting to the end, even if you weren't getting as far as you did last time, you were still always achieving something. Unlocking a new NPC, completing some sort of side objective, and if you beat a boss or complete certain objectives that you can unlock later, you get credits, which can be used to, among other things, acquire new items, and those items then get added to the pool of equipment that you have a chance of acquiring randomly during a run. In short, you're always progressing towards something, even if it's not the main objective. Unlocking permanent access to new items is also something that Dead Cells does, but Dead Cells leans into it more heavily. You have a chance to acquire cells, the currency, from any enemy, not just bosses. You can access the shop where you unlock items between floors, not just in the hub area at the start. And this I feel is the most important distinction, in Dead Cells you can pay for these items in installments. You can just pump cells into unlocking a certain thing a bit at a time, across multiple runs. Again, it's all permanent, and the item will unlock once you've put in the required cumulative total, as opposed to having to pay the entire amount up front at once. Now, this is something that Dead Cells has to do for balancing purposes, because you do lose cells when you die, because again, Dark Souls is popular. But what this means is not only are you constantly building towards something, you're constantly investing in it actively. And what this means is you're more directly engaged with the act of unlocking new things. This and the way Dead Cells includes its Metroidvania elements feel like an extension of what Enter the Gungeon did vis-a-vis permanent progression. A way of taking the concept just a little bit further. And that's really the point I'm trying to illustrate about Dead Cells. Motion Twin, who developed and published Dead Cells, looked at the roguelike formula, looked at what had been done with it in the past, and thought, what can we add to that? What enhancements can we make to this formula that would set us apart? That's the attitude that makes a game work in a crowded space. If you want to stand out in a crowded genre like roguelikes, you need to look at what's already been done, look at what you're following on from, and think, what's the natural progression of that? What can we bring to the table that changes things up, makes us stand out a bit from our predecessors, but still makes sense and fits with the fundamental design principles of this genre? And that's what Dead Cells does so well. It takes the Metroidvania principle of unlocking access to new areas within older areas, and applies that to a style of game where not only are you going to be revisiting old areas constantly anyway, but because the game's progression path is a loop, you're going to be revisiting those old areas in a way that makes it feel like you're constantly progressing, rather than feeling like you're backtracking, thereby eliminating one of the Metroidvania genre's biggest turn-offs. A lot of players don't like backtracking, they find it tedious and they find it annoying. But in Dead Cells, you don't even know you're doing it. That, without wishing to be hyperbolic, is bloody ingenious. Now let's talk about Sundered. Sundered is a hand-drawn Metroidvania that, sarcasm aside, clearly does take some cues from Soulsborne games. Not just in terms of dying a lot being part of the gameplay, but also in terms of its tone and the indirect way in which it delivers its lore. However, Sundered holds that quantity has a quality all its own, and seeks to overwhelm the player with swarms of less powerful enemies rather than the traditional smattering of absolute bastards. Housing this, you have pretty standard Metroidvania fare. You go and you acquire new items and abilities that allow you to access areas you couldn't before. The game is focused around non-linear progression, which you can tell because one of the tips you get in the loading screens just says your progression should be non-linear, which... okay, I mean, it's weird that you would just say that. When you die, you get sent back to whatever they decided to rename the bonfire, and you can spend upgrade points on things like health and attack damage and whatnot, and hopefully have a better chance next time of getting further. You've also got a little Estus Flask situation going on, and a super move which I'm pretty sure they added in later, because I distinctly remember that button doing something else. But I've not yet talked about the reason this game is in this video. This Metroidvania has roguelike elements. With a massive fucking asterisk. So here's the game's punchline. Sundered has a fixed map. If you look at the map in-game, you can very clearly see all the things in the same place, every time, every run. It's very, very open about it. And I believe the reason for that can be traced back to the distinction I made between Sundered and Dead Cells nearer the beginning of the video. While Dead Cells is a roguelike that adds Metroidvania elements, Sundered starts at the Metroidvania end of the spectrum and then adds in the roguelike stuff. And Metroidvanias involve a whole lot of backtracking through a huge, sprawling map to find the things you couldn't interact with before but now can. And that means you need to be able to remember where everything is so you can come back to it. A good Metroidvania will emphasise memorable environments, littered with immediately recognisable landmarks that you can easily find your way to and from. Sundered stays true to that formula. It is very much a Metroidvania-style world. Big sprawling map, notable landmarks that you can find your way to and from in a fixed position on the map that you can see. And because the map's so big, that's probably for the best. The game world of Dead Cells is split up into a series of very confined areas. Finding the Metroidvania ability paths in there isn't a problem, because at the very least the thing you're looking for will always be in the same level every time. And each level's size is constrained enough that exploring the entire map theoretically only takes a matter of minutes. Sundered, on the other hand, is a full-on Metroidvania world map. And even ignoring the actual feasibility of randomising a map that size, if it worked, if a map the size of Sundered's completely changed configuration, if all the things you were looking for changed location every time you died, with the conceit being that you will die many times, you'd never get anything done. So yeah, if Sundered were to implement roguelike elements in the same way that Dead Cells did, progressing in the game would just become a Sisyphean task, taking the frustration far beyond any point where it could be called compelling. So when Sundered says that it has roguelike elements, what it means is it has a series of fixed memorable locations with the important stuff in them, and then the corridors between those areas are procedurally generated within the constraints of larger fixed corridors between those areas that the game shows you. It's right there on the map, it's perfectly visible, the game has a fixed map that doesn't change. It's just that some of the less important corridors between big areas will occasionally have a different configuration of largely similar rooms. It is the most token thing, and they're not even hiding it. All the strings are right there in front of your eyes. They pulled the curtain all the way back on this one to let you, the player, know that there was no reason for this map to be procedurally generated, because it basically isn't. A randomised map simply doesn't fit with how the rest of the game has been designed. So much so that in order to include one, they had to dilute the concept to the point where you kind of have to wonder why they even bothered putting it in. And the only reason I can think of for doing it is because roguelike games are, and were at the time of Sundered's release, very popular. This feels like a purely cynical decision. Thunder Lotus Games, the developers of Sundered, took the Metroidvania formula and said, how can we crowbar roguelike elements into this? That's where they fell down. That's where everyone jumping on a bandwagon always falls down. They didn't have an idea for a roguelike game. They had an idea for a Metroidvania game. A Metroidvania game so thoroughly incompatible with the roguelike elements they tried to include that they had to neuter those roguelike elements beyond all recognisability just to get them in there. All told, it's not like Sundered is a bad game. It's just I don't remember most of it, because there's so much wasted space that is, by design, completely interchangeable. They sacrificed memorability in exchange for an element of randomness that just doesn't add anything. And that's Sundered. And Dead Cells. Two games that can essentially be described using the same words in a different order, yet the experiences of playing them are almost polar opposites. And I hope I've done an effective job of explaining where I feel that difference comes from. But then again, maybe it's a moot point, because the truth is, I stopped playing both of these games ages ago. There is an inherent problem with designing a game to be played ad infinitum, and it's a problem shared by the current live services trend. If your game does not have a natural conclusion, the conclusion of the experience will simply become the moment the player gets bored of your game. It feels kind of weird to use the word closure when talking about video games, unless of course the sentence is about a studio that EA has bought. But the closure provided by a satisfying and definitive ending is a very important part of any entertainment experience. If that closure never comes, then what you're left with is a player just drifting along under their own power until they inevitably run out of steam. People aren't built to do the same single thing forever. Eventually stagnation sets in, returns diminish, and people burn out. This is particularly bad news for any game designed around repetition, both in the case of live services where repetition is always an implicit element, and more pertinently roguelikes, where repetition is an explicit conceit of the game. And the effect this winds up having in practice is one that retroactively sours the experience for players. Because the final memory a player is going to have of any of these games is always doomed to be the moment that that game officially outstayed its welcome. It's an effect that makes it very difficult to get back into these games once you've stopped. And it also makes them kind of difficult to recommend to anyone, even if you can still say that they're good. Because at this point you're just so numb to the idea of them. Thus the conversation around these games gradually fizzles out. And my worry is that a lot of these games are going to struggle to be remembered in quite the same way as those games that did allow themselves to actually end. Sundered is kind of a weird one in this case, because it actually does have a definitive end point, and yet it still somehow manages to suffer from this problem. So it really does feel as if they managed to take only the weaknesses of the roguelike genre. And that's why that particular game sticks out in my memory as being the example of why you need to be careful about how you implement roguelike elements in your game. But even if you do it right, there's a price to be paid. Dead Cells didn't make any missteps that I could name off the top of my head. But I can tell you right now with absolute certainty that I will have replayed Spider-Man for at least a third time before I would entertain the possibility of going back to Dead Cells. Because Spider-Man left me wanting more, whereas Dead Cells didn't leave me. I left it. Because with the game being what it is, it couldn't have happened any other way. Even Enter the Gungeon, a game that I absolutely adore, a game that I would go as far as to hold up as the gold standard for roguelikes, was compelling enough that I did eventually come back to it, but it didn't stop me from getting burnt out on it in the first place. This is the inevitable cost of trying to extend the life of your game in this way. Because you're only truly extending the theoretical runtime. And that's not the same thing. Living forever means more than simply not being able to die. And developers need to take great pains to make sure that their attempts to make their game immortal doesn't wind up being a Faustian bargain. Because truly, this is what all of those angsty vampires were talking about when they said immortality was a curse. They were warning you not to make too many roguelikes. Dracula tried to warn you, Sundered. Anyway, I just thought that was worth mentioning.